Good afternoon. Welcome to Church of the Redeemer. My name is Pamela Thompson. We will start with Sandra drumming and smudging to make sure that we're all in a good place. And then we will hear Douglas. There will be an opportunity for questions from those present in the church and through Stephen Allen, who's the moderator on Zoom. Please only use your hands. Don't try and speak, but once you put your hand up, please turn your volume on so that you're ready when Stephen recognizes you. Today, we at this gathering live on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. We honor that they have honored the land. We honor that they live in, for, and of the land. We want to walk with you, to do and say what needs to be done and said in this antagonistic society to make us all treaty people. And may I suggest that when somebody says, well, what can you tell me about Canada? Tell them it is a treaty land, a treaty country. When they ask who you are, say, I am a treaty person. We need to drum it into our brains that we are treaty people. It is my pleasure to introduce Douglas Sanderson, also known as Amo Binashii. He is Swampy Cree from the Beaver Clan, of the Beaver Clan from Opaskwayak First Nation, which is just across the river from the Paw, Manitoba. That's the best I can do. It's up there. It's like trying to describe where Timmins was 50 years ago. Now it's the center of the world, of course, but it didn't used to be. Douglas is our Redeemer's Visiting Indigenous Scholar, and this is his second lecture of that position. We are proud that he is with us and that he has agreed to be our Indigenous Scholar. Douglas is a lawyer and a law professor and a Fulbright Scholar. Although he was born in West Germany and traveled around Canada, Douglas was mostly in Western Canada. He is a prof at U of T, and his title is Pritchard Wilson Chair in Law and Public Policy. They didn't have chairs when I went to law school. And my class started one for our administrative law professor. And most people don't even know what administrative law is. But we loved him. Douglas has got lots of work and honors, and for this book he has received honors, and if this isn't in every curriculum in high school and university, in the next 3 years, I'll eat my shirt, and it's not edible. Valley of the Birdtail is not what he's here to talk about, but if you haven't read it, please do. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. It's a great book about stories, and at the end, there are suggestions on how to fix this mess that we're in, to give back to Indigenous people the respect and honor that they all deserve. Welcome, Douglas. Welcome, Sandra.
Okay, Sego, Skana. I know everyone knows me because I'm quite often asked to come and open for you. But for the ones that don't know, my name is Sandra Campbell, and I come from Ganawakea, Wata, Mohawk First Nation. And it was brought to me, I was asked to do the opening for Douglas. Welcome. Look forward to hearing you. But it was to concentrate on anger and grieving. Tough topics. Ooh. Okay, so I have my smudge here, so I'll just start it. 2023 technology, lighter. Before I used to have to take 2 sticks and rub them. Oh, we have such a sense of humor today. I hear some chuckles. I like to acknowledge that eastern direction, the direction where the sun rises and new beginnings start. And as we're on our spiritual path, there are some things I have not mentioned at this moment, and I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich, Nawagoa. Thank you. Oh, and then I'd like to acknowledge that southern direction, the direction of summertime, the direction where our youth sit. It's also a time of action. And as we're walking in our life and on our spiritual path, we are in action. And if there's certain things I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of it, I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich, Nawagoa, thank you. Oh. And then I'd like to acknowledge that western direction. This is the direction that the sun is set at. It's also a direction where our women sit in the lodge. And this is the direction that we'll be looking out. This is the direction that we walk out of when we leave this plane and into that spiritual realm. And we will be looking in that and diving into that direction. But just to let you know, there's no true words or descriptions to describe this direction. It is a direction that when you step out of, no one has really truly have entered there and have come back to tell us. They might have visited just briefly. And if there's certain things I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of, I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich, Nawagoa, thank you. And then I'd like to acknowledge that northern direction. This is the direction where our elders sit. This is also a direction in wintertime. It is also the direction that where our elders sit and we present our tobacco ties to, so we can have some good direction in our lives on how to conduct ourselves in our work, in raising our family, or what other questions. It's also a time that it's winter time, we share our songs, our dances, a lot of story time, a lot of learning from each other in community. And if there's certain things at this particular moment I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of, I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich, Nawagoa, thank you. And as we completed that circle, the circle that the Creator had brought us in, and in our lives, in our spiritual path, I like to acknowledge our ancestors. These are the ones when they were alive. They did what they needed to do so that we could have this good life today. They could have been a grandma, a grandpa, a mother, a father, an aunt or an uncle, someone that we hold in high esteem as close to our hearts. And I like to acknowledge that now. And I'm sure I'm going to throw a little bit in there for Douglas to welcome, because I'm sure he's going to be bringing some lived experiences and some experiences that his ancestors had experienced and have passed on. So I'd like to acknowledge that. And if there's certain things I'm unaware of or I have not mentioned, I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich, Nawagoa, thank you. And then I'd like to acknowledge Mother Earth, always providing for us, unconditionally. Provides us with all our clothing and all our food, all our shelter. And my grandson here is my helper. He likes technology. So all those little fancy computer chips Mother Earth has provided. I say that with love to my grandson. And if there's certain things I have not mentioned or if I'm unaware of, I'm going to acknowledge that now and say, Jimikwich, Nawagoa, thank you. And as we enter into that center, the center of balance, where the Creator has known us even before we were born, because we start off as spiritual beings. And as we start off as spiritual beings, we enter it back, starting into that eastern direction, the direction of love. So in kindness, if there's certain things I have not mentioned, or if I'm unaware of, I like to say, Jimikwich, Nawagoa, thank you. Jimikwich, 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 ha-ha. So my little helper, come take my pen and my technology. So as I always do a drum song, and what's coming to me is the Mi'kmaq drum song. It's an honoring song, but also a welcoming song and a feasting song. So today we're going to feast on Douglas words and dwell in it and wallow in it and roll in it and wrestle with it. And so here it goes. So I wish everyone a good day, and hope you get everything out that you need to learn as we sit together and learn from each other. Sometimes we have to do the work ourselves.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out today, and thank you for that very generous introduction and for the beautiful opening prayer. Thank you so much. Stephen Allen, who helped organize today, was asking me, what's it about? You just got a title. And I was like, I'm not really sure. So this is all sort of new material. This is all stuff that I haven't really spoken about before, some of it. And so I'm actually, I was warned it might be a small audience today, but I think this topic is also going to prove very intimate. And so this is exactly the right setting. Thanks again for having me today. On December 31st, 2019, the Chinese government announced cases of an unknown pneumonia in Wuhan, China. Air travel ended. Travel ended. And we were all at home, wondering when or how life would get back to normal. It's been almost 4 years, and I think we've all had a pretty rough time of it, each of us in our own ways. And I have to say that for my part, things weren't so bad. I could do my teaching job from my basement, began working on a book that would become a national bestseller. My wife and I carried on as before, and my children managed to finish school. But things started to unravel in unexpected ways. My mother and I stopped talking a couple of years ago. She was pretty deaf, and so the phone was no good, and talking only led to miscommunication and confusion and frustration. And so, like a lot of people, I just spent a lot of time on Facebook and made casual contact with people I hadn't seen in years. Old memories surfaced, and so too did old friends. Unlike a lot of people, though, death didn't linger on my doorstep during the pandemic. I missed weddings and bar mitzvahs and travel plans and the like, but few funerals, and I counted myself lucky. There was grieving, of course. We all grieved. We found ourselves in a world that was no longer our own, and there was a palpable sense of loss. Everyone lost, and everyone grieved. Though I think it took us a while to sort through all of those feelings. It was a kind of loss that none of us had ever experienced before, none of us could have ever even imagined. We don't really do condolence much today. It's hard to know what that word even really means. The modern dictionary describes condolence as a formal declaration of sympathy. The Oxford English Dictionary places that definition, the formal declaration of sympathy, from the early 1700s. But there is an earlier definition. Between 1603 and 1721, condolence had a different meaning. Condolence was, in those days, a kind of sympathetic grief. It was a sorrow with and for others. In these years, condolence was described as a fellow feeling of another's sorrow. Rather than a declaration of sympathy, condolence in those years rode along a knife edge of verb-noun distinction. Condolence meant a kind of action, a sharing, the feeling of another's sorrow, rather than the mere speaking of words that underscores our contemporary definition. The intransitive form of the verb is to condole, and it too comes into French and English after 1600. Like condolence, to condole meant originally to share in grieving, and then later, in the form we use it today, to condole is to express sympathy. I was surprised that there was no earlier reference to condole or to condolence. Both words seem to come out of nowhere around 1600, and both shift their meaning to from sharing grief to an expression of grief sometime prior to 1800. When I first made this discovery, I remember sitting at my computer in a kind of stunned disbelief. First, how was it possible that the English language had no word for expressing or sharing grief prior to 1600? And secondly, why would the meaning of the word condolence shift in a time as short as 200 years? How did we get from sharing grief to simply expressing sympathy? What could have happened to hollow out what was once a shared experience to something more in line with a Hallmark card? And on a hunch, I looked into a French dictionary. Same pattern. In the late 16th century, the French word condoler means to share grief. But by the 20th century, condoler meant nothing more than an expression of sympathy. Something had happened. So let's get back to that first point. Prior to the 17th century, there was no English word for condolence. What about synonyms? Commiserate seems closest to show or express compassion, but this too has its earliest appearance in 1587. Pity is older. In 1250, to pity someone was to show a tenderness aroused by suffering. And then by the late 15th century, it meant to feel sorry for someone. So in some important sense, the English language, and so indeed English people, just had no way to express a shared sorrow. You could pity someone, you could feel compassion about their plight, or feel sorry for them, but you couldn't express the feeling of sharing sorrow with another human being. There's a great book written by a Canadian ethnologist named Hugh Brodie, The Other Side of Eden. It's about himself as a civil servant in the 1970s when he went into the northern reaches of Canada to learn Inuktitut, because in 1970, no one who worked for the federal government spoke the language. Brodie arrives in the far north by plane and lands and sees what you or I would see, a vast, empty landscape of nothingness, just snow and ice in an unbroken landscape. But he sets about to learn Inuktitut, and as he does, and as the months pass, Davis notices this strange phenomenon. As he gazes out onto the land begins to fill itself with shape and form. As Davis learns Inuktitut, he learns words and concepts that make sense of the physical geography of the north. The landscape begins to reveal itself as Davis finds the language to see and understand and describe the world outside his window. And so without the right words, concepts are lost to us. We can't see or understand the ideas because we have no words to describe those ideas. We see only a barren landscape, whereas with the right words, we see a landscape brimming with environmental complexity. And so it is in this sense that Englishmen and Frenchmen could not condole one another. They could not share in one another's grief because they had at their disposal only this idea of pity, of feeling sorry for someone, but not in a way that shares their grief or lightens their load. There is an isolationist duality at play. I feel sorry for you, but I do not lift you up. I do not change your condition. I am isolated from you, but I feel sorry for you. Which should lead us to ask, how? How did this idea of sharing grief, of condoling and condolence, how did these ideas begin to appear in the heart of Europe beginning in the 17th century? Now, during that time, here around the Great Lakes and all along the eastern seaboard, English and French officials began entering into treaty with still powerful indigenous nations. To the south of us, there was the Five Nations Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, the people who build the longhouses, who allied with the British. And to the north, the French allied with the Confederacy of Anishinaabe, Huron, and Sauk. Still further north, beginning from the mid-17th century, the English charter company, the Hudson's Bay, set up posts all around James and Hudson's Bay and entered trade and the kind of treaty relationships familiar to their southern counterparts. These were not one-way relationships. Europeans did not hold an upper hand. And the Europeans themselves changed. They learned, adopted new ideas, and in this way, Europe herself became something she had not been. If nothing else, for a time, Europeans learned to share the grief of others. France was never too earnest about turning Canada into a colony, at least not the kind of colony like the 13 English colonies along the eastern seaboard. Sure, the French sent Jesuit missionaries and colonial and military officials. Eventually, they even sent several hundred prostitutes. But there was just never a sustained effort to make Canada into a thriving French colony. And since the little settlement that the French engaged in mostly took place along the St. Lawrence, French fur traders needed to penetrate into the interior by canoe to find willing trading partners in the inland country above the Great Lakes. The French built some forts in the interior, but they were relatively lightly manned. There really weren't that many French soldiers, and the terrain massively disfavored French military tactics anyway. This meant that the French traders who ventured inland did so perhaps in the company of a Jesuit, but very rarely with any kind of military presence. Fur traders were isolated and vulnerable. The only real form of protection in the out country was to establish relations with the local indigenous population. And among these populations, there were only two kinds of relationships: family and enemy. French fur traders thus felt a pressing need to be seen moving from stranger, and hence enemy, to a protected family member enmeshed in a web of productive relations. French colonial administrators were anxious. Fur traders were being exposed to something they had never seen before: the relative equality between citizens in Indian country. Indigenous leaders held no power to compel their followers to do anything. And this freedom to say no to authority, this terrified French administrators. That freedom, the sauvage state, risked infecting young fur traders, young men with new ideas and new habits in mind. This is mostly why they sent the Jesuits, to hold fast the souls of young Frenchmen as much as claiming of new souls for a Christian God. Along the eastern seaboard clung the 13 colonies that would eventually become the United States. But while still possessions of the British imperial crown, the 13 colonies were headed by crown appointees. While in many ways independent, the colonies reported back to what was known as the Board of Trade, and what the Board of Trade was concerned with was the relationship between the colonies and their indigenous neighbors. It was never British policy to simply take Indian land. Even had the British wanted this outcome, it would be centuries before the colonists had the military and demographic capacity to enforce their will. Instead, the imperial crown implemented at first a policy whereby settlers could buy land from any willing indigenous seller, provided the purchaser also secured a license from the colonial government. After 1763, only the crown could purchase land from indigenous people. And those purchases would be in the form of a public treaty, and no colonists could cross over into Indian territory until a treaty had been made. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 deemed all lands west of the proclamation line to be reserved for the Indians. And the British wanted to buy a lot of land, more and more with each passing year. In turn, this meant that British officials were entering into treaty after treaty with the local indigenous population, and in particular, what was originally the Five Nations. An Iroquoian confederacy holding a vast territory, an empire, really, south of the Great Lakes. In practice, this engagement in treaty after treaty, year after year, decade after decade, meant sustained political relations between two complex nations. England and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy grew an alliance that came to be known as the Covenant Chain. The Covenant Chain is a metaphor. The chain is the link between the British and the Five Nations. At first, when the relationship was merely commercial, the chain was said to be of iron. As that commercial relationship hardened and deepened into long military alliance, the iron chain was transmuted to a chain of silver, and that chain needed annual polishing in the form of treaty renewal. Entering into treaty was to acknowledge an ongoing relationship, a relationship that needed basic annual maintenance. The covenant chain created a frame within which to understand each partner's needs and interests, and the structure of this frame was almost wholly indigenous. The requirement of annual renewal is obviously indigenous, but so too are the physical artifacts of treaty making, the ceremonial mats on which the parties would sit as discussions unfolded, the call and response format, which required one party to repeat word for word the speech given by the other party earlier that morning or the night before, and perhaps most importantly, the indigenous technologies known as wampum and the ceremonial calumet, or pipe. Now, historically, the calumet, the pipe, and its medicine moved west to east, likely originating in the plains and traveling west through the Blackfoot people and Sioux and Anishinaabe, and eventually to the Haudenosaunee people. As a technology, smoking the pipe instilled a sense of calm in its users. It prepared the participants for reasoned debate. The pipe and sacred tobacco worked together to generate the conditions of mind under which meaningful discussion could be generated. And thereupon, thoughtful, deliberate discussions and debates could unfold. This is why the pipe always precedes treaty discussions. It is the technology, the pipe and tobacco, which clears the mind as preparation for deliberation and reasoned discourse. Like so many indigenous technologies, the pipe was adopted by the English and the French, and in both cases, the technology migrated quietly back to Europe to be taken into coffee shops during the early stirrings of the European Enlightenment. And there, in those coffee shops, English and French gentlemen put tobacco in their pipes and sat to talk about new ideas. Ideas from the New World, ideas about freedom and the role of the state, ideas about democracy and governance. And there they sat with their pipes of tobacco, puffing away, talking politics like they invented the thing. Besides the pipe, also called the calumet, was an indigenous technology so amazing that it altered English and French perceptions of the world and of their relationship to others in the world. Altered these perceptions in such a deep and profound way that we are only beginning to see the influence. Like the pipe, this technology was designed to bring about a state of mind. We might describe this state of mind as being like a kind of presence, a physical presence, but also an awareness of others. In this state of mind, we are able to communicate clearly and really hear and understand what others are saying. It is precisely the state of mind that one wants front and center in political discourse between nations. I am speaking now of wampum. Wampum are a kind of building material. They start off as shells, and traditionally indigenous people along the eastern seaboard used only two kinds of shells: whelk shells, which are white, and quahog shells, which are dark. The oldest ones are so purple they are almost black. In the ocean wild, quahog are preyed upon by whelk clams. So even before their harvest and ceremonial use, life and death are situated within the duality posed by these two species. Upon harvesting, the shells can be turned into wampum, a kind of bead. To do this, the clam's shell is first cracked into pieces, and then each of those pieces is slowly filed and ground into a rough cylinder. Then each cylinder is drilled from one side and then from the other until the holes meet in the middle. Even with modern drills and grinders, this process is incredibly time-consuming. Once the shells have been formed into wampum, they are woven into a pattern, and the result is what we call a wampum belt and the French called collars. Each shell bead is strung into place, one against the other, until a vertical line is complete. Then work begins on the next line. The process is painstaking. The British first came to know wampum in the context of diplomacy. British colonial governments were regularly engaged in treaty discussions with their Haudenosaunee counterparts, and British success turned on their ability to learn and engage in indigenous forms of diplomacy. Many of these diplomatic forms included use of wampum belts and strings. During discussions, for example, a speaker would punctuate their dialogue by laying down a belt to emphasize this point or that. The written treaty records display a growing British awareness of the wampum protocols. And the British learned to make the belts, learned how to use them in speeches, and how to empower their diplomacy with their indigenous allies. Wampum belts were used to negotiate treaties, but more than that, they were used to record treaty arrangements. Now, why don't we just look at a few? This belt is known as the 24 Nations belt. It's pretty big. It was made by the British and given to the Haudenosaunee, or given to their Indigenous allies at the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. The belt displays each of the nations that came to enter into treaty in Niagara in 1764, and they are all held together by a line. And that line is the covenant chain. This belt, also made by the British, also given at Niagara in 1764, is known as the covenant chain belt. So you can see the British very quickly learned how to adopt these technologies, how to use them in negotiations, how to encode them. My favorite thing about encoding them is that there's only black and white, so the encoding is binary. It's like computer code, it's ones and zeros. Bruce Morito has written that as a technology, wampum presupposes knowledge of suffering. What could that mean? There is a Haudenosaunee ceremony that takes place at almost every gathering, and the complexity of the ceremony varies with its size and the context of the event. But the ever-present element is a requirement to acknowledge the suffering of your treaty or meeting partner. To do this, the Haudenosaunee used wampum belts or beads to literally wipe away the tears of their counterparts. The ceremony requires one to acknowledge the suffering of the other party. Think of that for just a moment. Imagine a world where other people took seriously your pain, your loss, your suffering. And where taking that seriously meant to acknowledge that pain and then to condole you, to share in your suffering. Such compassion. But precisely this compassion was ever present in the Haudenosaunee world. And that meant that for decades, many decades, this compassion, this capacity to condole others was a central part of the British and French experience in the early and middle encounter period. During what is known as the Three Bear Words ceremony, one strand of bead or one belt is first used to clean the eyes, to literally wipe away the tears. A second belt cleanses the throat, and a third unblocks the ears. This is not mere ceremony, empty gestures in a shadow play. To the Haudenosaunee and those who engaged in these ceremonies, the effect was profound. Year after year, ceremony after ceremony, the British and Haudenosaunee bound themselves together, first as trading partners, then allies, and finally as brothers. As the covenant chain morphed from rope to iron link to a silver chain that was polished by annual renewal of commitment and condolence. And these ceremonies had a profound effect on the European participants. Settlers, soldiers, diplomats, civil servants grew to know something new in their lives, a capacity never before seen in Europe. The capacity to experience and describe the feeling of sharing in another being's grief. Condoling entered into print in the English language just as Europe began their long engagement of treaty partnership with Indigenous peoples. To the Europeans, this idea of shared grief wasn't just new, it evinced a whole new human capacity. The power to not just feel bad for someone, to pity them. But here along the eastern seaboard and around the Great Lakes, Europeans learned what it was to offer condolence, the sharing of grief, the easing of burdens, and the acknowledgement that suffering is part of the human experience. Now, after the American Revolution, the 13 colonies quickly turned on their Indigenous allies, throwing treaty promises aside and taking what they could. After the War of 1812, enormous tracts of the Haudenosaunee and other people's lands were handed to the Americans by the British with no consultation of the Indigenous nations whose land was being put on the post-war peace table. And it wasn't just that the land went away, though it did. More than that, the British diplomats and soldiers who had long engaged in Indigenous treaty making died in war, or they returned to England, or grew old and left the civil service. The once annual treaty renewals ended. The British let go their end of the chain. In one meeting, the Anishinaabe held high the wampum belts that had encoded a prior treaty, and where once the British would have reciprocated, producing belts of their own, placing down the belts to punctuate their commitments, now they just stood there, unable to reciprocate. Ignorant of their own treaty promises, wampum no longer compelled action, only silent confusion. In the previous century, William Johnson, Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British, spent weeks and weeks, months, even years, seeking out correspondence describing the relationships with their treaty partners at Niagara and Albany and Philadelphia. Johnson used the written records to reproduce the treaty ceremonies and engaged in these traditions as a knowing participant. In just 100 short years, we moved from a world where a curious Johnson could learn from the colonial records everything he needed to begin the journey as a competent treaty negotiator and wampum encoder, to that of Lord Bondhead, who in 1836 remarked along the lines that while it was certain that there were agreements with the Indians, these were in the nature of equity, not law, and given their oral form, were now lost to time. And as the British turned away from their Indigenous allies, so too did their understanding of condolence. The word condole and the act of condolence that once meant the sharing of the grief of others transmuted in meaning, such that the sharing of grief was set aside, and instead condolence came to mean something close to pity, nothing more than an expression of grief. I think that there is something powerful in this account, but there are some things that the historic record does not disclose. How are we to understand what it is to share grief, to condole or be condoled in that older sense of the word? To condole once was to share in the grief of others, and to do that you needed to know the other person. You needed to be able to understand them to share their grief, to see them for who they are. Only then can you share their grief and lift them up. I'd like to share a couple stories from the past year that has given me some ways to try and understand these teachings. The first story is about how condolence requires you to know the person you are condoling. And the second is about what it means to know someone in a way that makes condolence possible. So here's the first story. I started this talk going back to the start of the pandemic, and I said that for the most part, this was not terrible for me. I found old friends on Facebook and whiled away the time. But like I said, things began to unwind. My mother and I, as I said earlier, we had largely stopped talking on the phone, and now travel wasn't possible. I tried writing and texting, but nothing really came of it. And at the end of January, 10 months ago, she died in hospital in Winnipeg on the coldest night of the year. I am reminded here also that today marks the 17th, would have been the 17th anniversary of her heart transplant. And that heart gave her another 17 years until this year. And it wasn't like the movies. We did not get a long final goodbye. We had no chance to make up for lost time or to say the things we always wanted to say. Instead, her breathing grew shallow, peace came upon her, and she slipped from this earth. It is devastating to lose a parent, but I was not devastated. My mother and I didn't really know each other. As a kid, she was always at school. She completed as an adult her BA in education and then later her master's in education. She took jobs in Winnipeg, but I was still with my father in British Columbia. Year by year passed, and as adults, we never took the time to make up for the past. On the day of the funeral, I still could not grieve. I was sad, for sure, but not the kind of sad that I thought I would be. It was just kind of, sad. The funeral was a traditional Middayawan ceremony. The Midday people are an ancient order of Indigenous knowledge keepers, and all the Midday people came out. It was a beautiful ceremony. The Midday did this really, really nice job of separating the idea of the spirit of the person and what we have to do to take care of that part of the being, to make sure they complete their journey, and the idea of the husk, the shell, the body, that has done its work and now must be committed to the earth. At one point, I found myself beside my sister at the casket end of a makeshift receiving line. One by one, my mother's friends and colleagues and lodge siblings came to pay their respects, and I didn't know what to say. I didn't grow up among any of these people. I didn't really know who they were. They didn't know who I was. And then it happened. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. I graduated law school alongside a young Indigenous woman named Donis Kennedy. After law school, she moved back to Winnipeg and resumed her position in the community and the lodge. She knew my mother. She was a Middayawan woman, so I should have anticipated her attendance. But I hadn't. And then there in this moment, I turned from greeting a stranger and looked into the eyes of Donis Kennedy. I stood quiet just for a moment, and then I lost it completely. I just fell into Donis's arms, and I cried, heaving, sobbing, tear-stained face. In the months since, I've thought a lot about that moment. Why Donis? What about her presence allowed me to finally grieve? I still don't know, but there is this. I was among my family, but they didn't really know me. And I was among my mother's many friends. She was revered. But prior to this, whenever I'd been with my mother and she would introduce me, the response was always the same. Esther, I didn't know you had a son. I was unknown. But then there was Donis, the one person in that room who knew me as the son of Esther Sanderson and also knew the Toronto version of me, the student, the lawyer, the law professor. And there, only there, in that tiny bit of middle space where I was to someone a whole person, there in that space, and only that space, could I grieve. Only when someone knew the whole me. And here's the second story. Somewhere in the weeks after my mother's funeral, I was with my kids and we were eating French fries with gravy. And you know how the taste of or smell can pull you back in time? Well, that's what happened. One moment, I'm in my kitchen with my kids, and the next moment, I'm back in elementary school. Sometime in the first dozen or so years of my life on this earth, a small growth began deep in my upper right femur. I didn't know it was there, it didn't hurt, and there was no other way to tell. But without any of us knowing, what turned out to be a cyst kept growing. until one day the cyst had consumed a length of my right femur, held together only by a pencil line of bone. And then that too gave way, and I went down hard. Excuse me. I spent several months in traction, and then because the break was so high on my leg, I was put into a body cast. I had a wheelchair, but with me in the cast, it was heavy and unwieldy. I honestly don't remember my parents ever taking me out in the thing, though I suppose they must have. What I do remember is this kid who lived up the street from me, Mark Perry. He was in my grade, but even by the age of 11, he was starting to go off the rails. He missed a lot of school, and there were rumors. But Mark started coming by my house. He would help me down the stairs, get me into the chair, and then he would push me around the neighborhood. Often we'd end up at a lunch counter, usually the Stedman's department store lunch counter, and there we would eat French fries with gravy. And that was the taste that brought it all back to me. Later that night, I found Mark on Facebook. Now, we had grown apart, and we had grown apart so quickly. I don't even remember it happening. But in the years after those lunches at Stedman's, Mark continued his descent. The rumors continued, and the rumors were dark. Mark was accused of all kinds of things, some truly heinous stuff. And I really don't know if any of it was true. And it all kind of slipped from my mind until that afternoon with my kids and the gravy. And so I reached out. I sent Mark a message. I wrote him on Facebook and said, hey, I had this gravy earlier tonight, and it took me straight back to those days at Stedman's, and I don't know if I ever thanked you for that. But I really should have. You looked out for me, and I should have said it earlier. Thank you. Mark wrote back the next day. He thanked me. He said he'd kind of followed my life on Facebook. And now, now he was in the final stages of his own life. He told me he had cancer, terminal. And the pain of it was too much. He had started the process for an assisted suicide. I didn't know what to do when I read that. I mean, what do you do? I didn't know what to say. So, via message, I just kind of blurted out that I would be in Vancouver in 3 or 4 months. It was a book tour event. And I didn't really hear back from him, other than for him to say that it would be great for us to get together. And a month later, actually, I was in Vancouver. Excuse me. But I didn't see Mark. Instead, I saw his brother Scott, who I kind of knew from high school. Scott had come out to a book reading as part of my book tour, and we ended up hanging out afterwards. At some point, I asked Scott how Mark was doing. Thank you. Scott looked confused, then a little sad, and finally resigned. I haven't spoken to Mark in years. No one in the family does. Scott, I said, did you know that Mark was really sick? Shook his head. And the next day I got back on my book tour and got back on my life. Days later, I got a message from Scott. He said that he had, well, after we met, he realized that he had to try and get his relationship with his brother back on track. He said they started to meet once a week. He said it was hard to get past all the hard stuff. But he would put it aside to be in a relationship with his brother. A few weeks after that, Scott wrote again, this time to say that Mark was still serious about assisted suicide. and that he said he would have done it last month, but he was holding on, waiting until June when I said I would come for a visit. I held on to that knowledge, booked my flights to pass through Vancouver, where Mark and Scott lived, on my way to Victoria, where I had more book tour. When the day arrived, I left Toronto very early in the morning, flew to Vancouver, and Scott picked me up from my hotel. As we drove, Scott said, listen, I don't know if any of this is really true. I don't speak to his doctors. I don't know what to believe. I just wanted you to know. And somehow, oh, thank you, I felt better about the whole thing. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. Maybe it was all just make-believe. But I was there. So we went to a little restaurant in the East End and sat on the patio. Mark showed up after a while. He looked haggard and old beyond his years and unkempt. And now it was his turn to be in the wheelchair. We drank some beer and chatted for a couple of hours. Just kind of chatted. I mean, we don't really have a lot in common and haven't seen each other for 40 years. The sun set and I excused myself. I'd been awake for 20 hours at that point. I slept easily. And then my life went on. Everything went back to the way it was for a few days. And then Scott messaged me. It was all true, he said. And Mark had chosen today to end his life. They were in a park, sitting in the sun, Mark's little dog on his lap. Mark died that afternoon. It took a few days for Mark's death to hit me, but it did. I cried and I cried. I'm crying now. In Mark's case, I think I was the only one who could see the whole person. The dark person Mark had become, but also I alone knew him as a little boy who cared for me when no one else did. I never really told anyone about Mark back in those days, or even in the years that followed. And though I didn't see him after our middle teens, the stories and rumors never really stopped. Whatever he had become, whatever would cause his own family to disown him, I knew him differently. Some days it feels like I was the only one for whom he acted not just kindly, but selflessly. He acted towards me with nothing but generosity and kindness and a kind of pureness, and I saw him. The whole him. And I think in those final days, he needed to be seen. It was, in the end, his way of being condoled by the one person who could. Miigwech, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Stephen and Pam, and everyone here at the Redeemer, and everyone online. Sorry for the tears. It's all new material. Thank you so very much. Oh, right.
Okay, is this showing? Just to give you another look while we start asking questions. These are our most beautiful, a lot better than all the golden clocks in Buckingham Palace. This is a heavy one, in more ways than one. Thank you, Douglas. May I hug you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, now we have questions, so don't go away.
Okay.
Come on.
All right.
You can hold your glass.
Okay.
Okay, are we together? Yes.
Yep.
I don't know where the camera is, I just see my
I think
head
it's
turn.
over there, but I'm not sure.
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
okay.
Oh, or maybe it's right there, that big camera-looking thing.
Oh, yeah, hi. Is there anybody here that has a question before I go to Zoom? Stephen Allen, who is right here. Morgan, can you turn back on the gallery with everybody, not just the ones who have their cameras on, please? Stephen I've been watching, and the chat was very busy. I hope it was all friendly and loving. It's hard to tell when you're miles away from it. So is there a question here for Douglas, or an observation or a sharing before we go to the Zoom questions? Sandra? Well, it's just a comment. Stand up, please. It's just a comment. Louder.
There's a mic there, too.
Oh, there's Tony with the mic.
It's just a comment or something I noticed while you were sharing, because I know what condolences is and condoling. I really heard empathy.
I didn't hear
Just
you.
so empathy,
Empathy.
throwing in the pot, stirring it. It goes along with condoling. Being that whole person, like you mentioned, having that lived experience and being able, even though you haven't experienced fullness, but accepting the person as a full person and having that empathy.
Yes, thank you so much.
I really appreciate, I mean, I know the word condolence, and at my age, I'm sending them out a lot. To think of it as a verb, condole, and of course, dole comes from the French douleur, which is suffering. Makes a lot more sense that it's condole, to suffer together. And I'd never broken the word down. I've written it dozens of times, if not hundreds, and I really appreciate that. And it gives me, along with your stories, it gives me a context for that word and a meaning of the word that it didn't have before, and I really appreciate that. Okay, now, Stephen, I'm not sure how this works. Morgan, do you turn something on, or turn him on, or turn me off?
Can you hear me? Yes. Pamela, can you hear me in the church? Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me, Pamela?
Yes!
Wonderful. I'm just waiting for a question, but here's one that I have. And I wonder, Douglas, if we would come to a point in this country where settlers and newcomers had the capacity to grieve for the harm done in not respecting the treaties not treating Indigenous people the way we have, but setting up a new journey. But if that collective grieving would take us on a giant step toward something we call reconciliation.
So, a little while ago, I came to kind of a hard realization. And it has to do with reconciliation broadly, but, I think we sort of want to go back to 2015, 2016. And that's when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out. And, many people have expressed a strong desire to be engaged in reconciliation. And it's hard to do, in part because reconciliation is actually a noun. It's like trying to do potato, right? Like it's not a good descriptive word for action. So it's hard to figure out how to do reconciliation. But more important than that, I realized several months ago that somehow we all blew past the truth part. Right? Like everyone on the right or on the left or in the middle had their own reasons for thinking that they knew it all. And they didn't need to learn anymore, and let's just get on with that reconciliation. And I don't think that's going to work. While they may not have chosen an ideal word, they did understand that this is a two-step process. And that until we can grapple with where we have been and be honest with ourselves about that, I don't really see that we're going to get very far in the reconciliation stuff. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the executive summary was 700 pages. Right? There's 5 volumes of it. There's lots to read. There's lots to learn. And I think that maybe we just sort of went, well, I've heard about residential schools now, ready for reconciliation. And I think that most Canadians don't really realize that residential schools, while bad and terrible, are really just a fairly small part of the story of a failed relationship. And it'll be much easier for us, I think, to come to terms with our shared future and the possibilities there if we've had an honest accounting about where we've been. And so I don't know how to advance reconciliation. I don't know if grieving is going to get there. But the reason that that I have the material for this lecture today is because I'm still working on truth. Right? I'm still looking in the dictionary. Right? I'm going back to the Oxford English Dictionary to just look up the meaning of words, to see how they influence. The learning part, the truth part it's important. And we've sort of just forgotten about it. And I would just encourage everyone to do their best to live up to that part of the report, because it's going to make the reconciliation part possible when we're ready for it.
Stephen, anybody got their hand up? You've got to use the reactions, raise hand for Stephen to see.
Invite Nancy Luna to ask her question. Nope, sorry, she's saying no. Anyone else in the Zoom group? None at this point.
Okay, well, that's very odd because there's so much truth out there to learn. Redeemer has been on the journey of the truth aimed towards reconciliation. The newest word from the Indigenous community is reconciliation. It's still a noun, but
But it's got action in it.
it's got action in it. But ISWG has been working on disseminating truth, if you will, for the last 10 years here at Redeemer and in the community. And here we have a question from Otis. And we'll listen to the question and then see if your dad wants to answer.
Throughout your talk that you just gave, you touched a lot on, like...
Put the mic closer, please.
You
Otis.
talked a lot... Oh, wow. That
That's
gets
fine.
You talked a lot about understanding, like, the entirety of someone or something. And so... so I thought I'd ask, because as you've just touched on, the truth part of Truth and Reconciliation is an oft overlooked portion. Do you think that there is a way for people who, weren't, who how do you think someone who wouldn't be personally attached to the story of Canada, how do you think that they would be able to fully understand and be able to participate in the reconciliation?
Okay. Thank you, Otis. I should mention too that Otis is here, but he should really be at home working on his own speech, which he has for his French class. So it's going to be even better than this one because it'll be in French. It's hard for me to describe for people what it is that they might do. Because ultimately, I think people ask me that sometimes because I'm a law professor. And maybe there'll be some law answer or something. But there really isn't. Because whatever reconciliation is it's a process that will unfold over time. And it's also a political process, not a legal one. And that means that to get it done, to get moving, everyone needs to take part. And we're not all going to be doing the same things. We're all going to take into our hearts the idea of doing right, being just, being good people. And if we in that state tend to the history part and do the learning, we will be motivated for change in the future. But the form of that change is going to vary from person to person because each of us is in the world in our own way. Each of us can wrap our arms around different people. And it's going to take a whole community, a nation, working together in many, many ways to right this ship. I don't even know what it looks like in the end, but I know that we start with the truth, we get motivated for change, and we find it within ourselves to do something every day to make that world a little closer. And so I don't know how each of us is supposed to take on this task other than to do it with a good heart, try and stay just. And it's the aggregation of all of our little efforts that are eventually going to turn the ship around. But there's no one rowing pattern that's going to make it happen. Thanks, Otis. Oh, thank you. Oh.
Political, the sense that you use political, I assume, is the political and the small p polis, that we're all part of the polity. Is that the right word? never took political science. I have a question in the church. Yes, ma'am. Tony? And can you stand up, please?
Get here. Thanks very much. That was great. I was just wondering, could you comment on the fact, do you think that many of the things that are happening now, the signing of the treaties, the efforts to make various Indigenous groups do as they wish to do, become more economically productive if that's what they wish, or to build houses in Saanich, or whatever they do. Do you think these things are helping, or do you think that, because I think it's going to be a long time before we're all good enough that we all, are able to fully embrace the truth, but as short steps along the way, what do you think of the various treaties that are being signed or the steps that are being taken? Do you think they're helping, or?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So the one step that I think I would like us to undertake would be to just sort of get into our general heads, all of us, some sense of where are we trying to go? Like, what does it actually look like? Like, what are we actually trying to do? And once we have that kind of a vision, no matter how generic or vague it is, we can start looking at the stuff we're doing today, this treaty, that fishery, that economic development program, and ask, does it advance us towards our goal? I mean, in a very real sense, the federal, and to the lesser extent, the provincial governments, are just kind of making up policy as they go, right? I mean, it's partly reactive to Indigenous needs or lawsuits, but I never get the sense that there's a sustained vision and we're trying to get there. So I think in Valley of the Birdtail, towards the end, my co-author and I lay out some version of what we think a future might look like, a productive future. And we did that because we wanted to start coalescing people around some conception of the future so that we might be able to, in the present day, take steps in that direction. And no, like, don't do that, that's going the wrong way. It doesn't get a... So I think that's been missing from the discussion for a really long time. I don't know if it's... I think that maybe that vision was present back in 1763 when people actually met to talk about the future in these treaty arrangements, when they could make claim and counterclaim against one another, they were responsible to one another. But we haven't had that shared vision in a really long time. And so it's really hard to figure out, is this program good or is that program better? Because we don't have anything to judge them against. So some broader national vision, I think, is a key component in evaluating whether things are good or bad. And the second thing, which is unfortunate, and I hate to be the one to tell everyone, but things happen really slowly. Change happens really very slowly. And it took us a really long time to get into this mess, like 150 years. We're not going to turn it around tomorrow, probably not in my lifetime. And I say that because I don't want you to get discouraged. Right? Indigenous people are 5% of the population. On our own, we can't affect political change. It's just, we don't matter to politicians. And so we're never going to generate the political will to engage in those long-term solutions without you. And that means, believing today and tomorrow and next year and the year after, believing that what we're doing together is driving us towards a shared and better future. Yes?
Apologies.
So don't get discouraged.
Yes. Sorry, this is my second question.
Sure.
And I'm going to share an experience I had with a youth. We were here last week doing a drumming circle, and she said, living into my, an Indigenous female says, that's a youth, living into my responsibility. That's a big statement that she said. Healing and reconciliation, both sides need to do their work. They both need to heal. Meaning coming from the head, some operate from the head, some operate from the heart. And coming halfway, coming to meet in that great mind. So now is a period of us getting to know each other. Getting to know, and even the Church of Redeemers addressed language, how to best meet, for example, the Black culture or the identity and how it's used in the scriptures, but also too Indigenous and the way, we conduct ourselves and living into our responsibility, meaning living into the treaties. And so there must find a common ground, and that's where the dance is happening now. And we can't proceed, I agree with you 100% what you shared. I know it's your personal perspective. You don't foresee the future, but you're trying, like we all are trying. But yes, you're correct. Not wanting to operate from the heart, but not always operating from the head, and trying to be fair and justice in that kindness. That youth was saying, living in my responsibility, both sides need to heal. And that's where we're at. And that's part of the reconciliation. It doesn't say that's going to be nice and clean. It can get messy, right? And I can hear that in your speech when you talk about condolences and condoling and the empathy, getting to meet the person, the full person, both sides. And I just hope no one creates randomly policies that we regret tomorrow. Anyways, I'll pass it on. Thanks.
Thank you so very much.
Okay, we have
a question here.
one last question. We've got two here. I don't know if we have any there, Stephen. David.
Douglas, you mentioned that in your presentation that the War of 1812 seemed to be the tipping point between the old understanding of condolence and the new understanding of condolence. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Specifically, was it the introduction of military action that changed our understanding of the word?
So thanks for that. And I don't think it was the War of 1812 in particular. Things that sort of started to come undone. The Treaty of Niagara in 1764 is probably the highlight of the relationship, and that was a relationship fostered by William Johnson. He was pretty old by then, and William Johnson, he spoke Anishinaabe, he was married into an Indigenous family, he engaged in military adventures with his Indigenous allies, he learned the ceremonies, and he passed them on. He had a son and eventually a nephew who took up that position in Indian affairs and tried to continue. But things were spinning beyond their control. So more important, I think, in ending the relationship than the War of 1812 was the American independence, right? Like, what happens in 1763 with the Royal Proclamation, recall, is that the British colonial officials say, like, hey, there's a line here, British citizens, you can't cross it until we enter into treaty. And guess what? They didn't wait. They wanted the land, so they kept crossing it. And eventually, the British ended up using military force to retrieve colonists, burn their houses down, push them back to the British side. This eventually causes the 13 colonies to rise up, right? It's not about taxes or anything. It's about the British using military force against their own people. Now, once that happens, the colonies are set free, right? Like they are no longer feel bound by the old game. And if you think about Canadian and US history in relation to Indigenous peoples, what you see is that prior to the American Revolution, relationships with Indigenous people were really good. People bought land in an orderly fashion, learned each other's languages, entered into trade alliances. As soon as the independence happens, the colonies turn on their Indigenous allies. They don't care about them anymore. And sadly, exactly the same pattern in Canada. Right? Like things are, by 1832, Bondhead can't remember any of the treaties. Other colonial officials don't know how to do the wampum anymore. But it hasn't turned violent or bad. But right after Confederation, 1867, so that's when we start getting the numbered treaty regime, which are all boilerplate. That's when we get residential schools. That's when we get reservations. Like all the bad stuff happens in Canada and the United States after Confederation or after the American Revolution. And so I actually don't understand why people are down on colonialism. Because during the colonial times, things were pretty good. It's nationalism. Like once we got our hands on the oars, that's when we started going a different direction. And it's think about it. They're projects to build countries. They're national projects. Those projects take up land. Those projects take up resources. Those projects push people aside. Colonialism was largely about trying to get along in a very difficult world. But yeah, what really frees everyone is all the adults go home. Like Britain was all over the world with colonial administrators. Like they were professionals at this. They were good at it. But once they all went home, nobody even bothered to remember that there were treaties anymore. And that created the conditions during which old alliances could just slide. Yeah. Is that a question?
Michael.
It's on. Oh, okay. Yeah, my name is Michael. Tomorrow is Treaties Recognition Week, starting tomorrow till November 11th. I want to say that we have Indian Act chiefs, we have Longhouse chiefs, and we have hereditary chiefs, and they're not all on the same page. So the treaties, the most important, the treaties are very important to us. And this lady was talking about economic disparity. Mm-hmm. There's 633 reserves across Canada. And some of those reserves are living in squalid conditions. Mm-hmm. No safe drinking water or no access to water. Clean drinking water. And I think this thing about the nation-to-nation relationship that we have with the Crown, that has to be honored, respected, and upheld. And that has to happen. So it's not happening. So until that happens, we cannot move forward on our issues. We're going to continue with the status quo. That's what's going to happen. We're still in the status quo. We're not moving forward. We're not moving forward with the 94 calls to action. There's only 13 that have been implemented, and there's still the rest of them, about 87 to go. Miigwech.
Thank you.
Stephen, is there anyone at your end?
Yes, Dave Gordon, starting with a question.
trying to build trust in the local reserves in our neighborhood.
Well, let me say this. So the British and the French engaged very deeply in wampum traditions, and it's occurred to me that they did this without any sense that they were moving away from their Christian norms. That is, that the engagement with indigenous traditional knowledge and ideas around condolence and condoling, the use of wampum, the creating the belts, the using them in ceremonies, none of that was inconsistent with Catholic or Protestant belief systems. People were able to overlap them. And I think to a very large degree on the indigenous side, the same pattern held true, that there was really nothing inconsistent with Christian teachings in the indigenous communities. I mean, there were obviously different kinds of God, but the ideas that powered those beliefs were in no way inconsistent. I think maybe what has happened in part is that indigenous people came to experience a version of Christianity that was not only not receptive to wampum tradition, but to any kind. It grew actively hostile to any other belief system. And that, of course, has led to a condition of mistrust. But it's also placed indigenous communities in a position where they have lost knowledge. And I think people fight hard when they have this very little bit left to protect. And probably the last thing they want to do, really, is try and figure out how to incorporate that last little bit around a different belief system. You know, I give advice occasionally to the federal government, which they never follow, but increasingly I've been encouraging them to engage in indigenous protocol in indigenous communities. The problem is they don't know how to do that. And I think it is in some cases the case that indigenous communities are not entirely sure of how to do that. Like, some of that knowledge has been lost. It needs to be rediscovered. So I've been trying to encourage the federal government to create like this little department within the Privy Council office, a protocol office with protocol officers who would go to indigenous communities not to like learn the stuff, but to help learn them, so that they could learn and recover that knowledge together, so that when indigenous and government officials met, they could do something in the spirit of those old days. Like, could we bring back the mats, maybe? Right? Could smoking the pipe be part of the ceremony? Because it's not just an add-on, right? Like, it has a technological function to these discussions. And thinking about it that way has been lost to government officials. They regard it as merely ceremonial. And if that's merely ceremonial, like, how do we expect to get actual discussions done? Right? We don't even understand one another. Paul Williams, who just won a fantastic case in Quebec yesterday, told me this story one time about him picking up 4 elders from 6 nations and driving to Ottawa for a meeting. And when he got there, they sat around the conference table and they wanted to start the meeting. And Paul said, whoa, like, where's the sandwiches? Where's the coffee? And the ministry guys were like, we don't have a budget for that anymore. We don't do that. And Paul was like, I could never imagine living in a world where I asked people to drive 6 hours through the snow to come to a meeting and not feed them. that was the moment I realized, like, we don't even agree what a meeting is. Like, we don't agree what we're supposed to be doing around a table. And when we're that far apart, like, is it any wonder that we can't get the stuff in the middle to work properly? So I think it is incumbent upon not just government officials, but even church officials to consider how it is they might join in Indigenous communities in recovering those traditions, in actively seeking to redevelop them, to create new traditions, and not to imagine that there is a complete ceremonial world over there that you just need to learn. It's scattered, it's broken, and we need help to pick up the pieces. There's roles for all of us here. And I think where we can have the humility to understand that we don't understand, then we can create the space to help recover those traditions. And that's like the kind of active reconciliation that's going to make a real difference in the world, is participating with communities, like sharing their grief, not just expressing our sorrow. Like that kind of commitment is what I think we ultimately need.
It's Stephen here. Can you unmute me, Morgan? Yep, okay. Can you hear me? So I have a few comments from members of our Zoom fraternity, sorority, that I'd like to share with you, Douglas. I have actually 3 comments. What beautiful stories. I so appreciate your openness and vulnerability. I'll definitely be thinking about the word condolence and how to make it a different verb than I have in the past. The next comment is thank you for your sharing and openness. You've definitely given us much to think about and to ponder. And finally, an intimate and somewhat overwhelming presentation, lots to ponder. And just with these comments, I'm kind of reflecting that the latter part of your title is life, past, and present. And I think with your talk, you're also pointing us to be thinking about the future in a very different kind of way. That's what I have so far.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming, everyone who stayed online, and thank you to Pam and to the church, to my residency for the opportunity to work through complex ideas, hard ideas, in a space where I know I can trust you all, where I feel welcome and supported, and it's without that kind of environment, without that kind of support, I don't think that I could work through the ideas in the way that I've been able to do with you here today. So thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, sure. Yeah. English. These are the indigenous two-row wampum belt. And this is the Indigenous one-spoon tree and belt. So, yeah, please feel free to pick them up and hold them.
I know, the Christmas bazaar.
I just looked